Several years ago, in the before times, right in the middle of the semester at UTSA, one of my students missed an entire week of my special topics writing course. This wasn't an inconsequential thing. That's pretty close to the maximum amount of allowances that she had, and she was a good student, so it was concerning. She sent an email to make an appointment. I thought she wanted to go over kind of how she could get back on track. But when we got into the office, she somberly started to explain the reason that she'd had to miss. She said that her best friend's brother had been murdered, quite brutally from how she described it. And so, of course, she'd gone back home to be with her friend and to go to the funeral. But instead of asking me about the work that she had missed, she started to tell me that after the funeral, her best friend asked her if she would go with her to visit a psychic who claimed to be able to talk to the dead in an attempt to tell her brother goodbye. Now, this might seem odd why she's telling this to me, but in my special topics writing course at the University of Texas in San Antonio, we study the rhetoric of science and pseudoscience in the United States. And about 2 weeks prior to this, we'd had an entire module where we study psychics, and we study the ways they can convince people they know things they actually don't know. We study shotgunning and cold reading, number frequency, letter frequency, name frequency, the rhetorical and confidence tricks they use. And then we dissect so-called readings from people like John Edward, Teresa Caputo, and Tyler Henry. So it made sense why she wanted to talk to me about this. And she said that she went despite all of her misgivings, and she described how she sat there and she watched as this so-called psychic used every confidence trick that we studied in my class to convince her friend that she was saying goodbye to her brother. And she asked me with tears in her eyes, what should I have done? Should I have stopped it? I didn't do anything, but should I have busted the psychic and explained to my friend what she was doing and how she was doing it? Should I have taken away that moment where she thought she was getting to say goodbye to her brother? I didn't have an answer for her, and I still don't. But it was because of this situation and several others like it that I've started to reevaluate my role as a college instructor. See, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of college instructors as service providers, but in an industry that increasingly sees students more as consumers, we're closer to service providers than a lot of people want to admit. For instance, at the end of every semester, every student gets an evaluation card on their instructor, and our merit pay, our ability to continue teaching classes, is oftentimes tied to a student's relative happiness of the course. We're so desperate to attract students to campus that instead of investing in things that we need for academics, for example, UTSA has needed a new library for over 15 years, we instead invest in rock climbing walls and lazy rivers. The university is so concerned that our retention rate will go up a little bit or drop a little bit that we are encouraged to limit the number of Fs and Ds we award regardless of student performance. So for all intents and purposes, college instructors are service providers in a service industry that's marketing and selling diplomas. But like I said, because of this special topics writing course and some of the emotional situations I've been thrust into because of it, I've started to reevaluate what my role is. So in my writing course, I have my students keep a reading journal, and after I assign an article, I have them write their initial emotional reaction to whatever they've read. For 10 minutes straight, I tell them, don't censor yourself and just write whatever comes to your mind. And I collect these at the beginning of every class, and I walk from desk to desk. I grab a student spiral notebook. I scan the oftentimes illegible handwriting. I put a check on it, and I move on. This is a completion grade and nothing more. But one day I get to a young student who, during our normal classes, she was pretty quiet. Now, she wasn't a bad student who didn't participate, but in my classes there are a lot of discussions, sometimes heated ones, and she was always reserved, kind of shy. And her handwriting kind of reflected her demeanor. When I would look at her handwriting, it looked like her. The letters were really small and precise and extraordinarily neat and well-formed. But on that day when I picked up her spiral notebook, it looked wrong, for lack of a better word. It looked messy, it was scrawled, it looked angry. So instead of just scanning it, which is what I usually did, I actually started reading it, standing directly in front of the student. And I was immediately met by swear words, lots of them, from this normally reserved, quiet young woman. And so I kept reading to see if I could figure out what she was so upset about. The previous week, we'd been studying alternative medicines, homeopathy, acupuncture, cupping, that type of stuff. And I'd had the students read an article about Steve Jobs. Now, this article was not about Jobs as an innovator in technology. It was more about how Jobs, an otherwise brilliant man, was a big believer in alternative medicines. So much so that when Steve Jobs got cancer, and by the way, he had pancreatic cancer, which is normally a death sentence because it's asymptomatic up to stage 3, but he had a rare type, a neuroendocrine islet cell cancer, which, I made sure to look it up, if you can catch it before it metastasizes, there's a 95% chance of full recovery. That's unheard of with cancers, and they did catch it early. But he was such a big believer in alternative medicines that despite all the medical professionals' advice, he decided to try to treat it with juice cleanses and homeopathy and guided meditation. And he did this against the advice of all the medical professionals and his family for over 9 months, during which time that normally treatable cancer metastasized. And at that point, it's just a waiting game. So this was the article the students had read. And as I read her journal article, it was apparent that her dad had been suffering from cancer. Now that hit me pretty hard because at that time my mom was also struggling with cancer. And I kept reading. And I found out that her dad had been in contact with an alternative medicine doctor in Mexico City. And this man said that he had a cure for cancer. A cure for cancer that the FDA wouldn't let the American people take. A cure for cancer that Big Pharma didn't want you to know about because Big Pharma is in the business of keeping people sick. A cure for cancer that was both non-invasive and had 0 side effects. And as I read that, all I could think about was Mom, who I'd just talked to before I got into the classroom, who I knew was suffering from the after effects of chemotherapy, puffy and swollen, nauseated and in pain. And I knew the allure of that promise. And I kept reading, and I found out that her father stopped all of his treatment. And then he bought a plane ticket. And he told his wife and his daughter, my student, that he loved them. And he was going to come back completely cured. And he left. And he went to Mexico City. And he died there all alone. And in my student's angry, messy handwriting, she let her rage at the entire situation spill out over the page. Rage at the alternative medicine community, rage at her father for believing such utter nonsense, rage at Steve Jobs, but mostly rage at the con men who had tricked her dad. And towards the end of that journal entry, in that messy handwriting, she wrote, "Dad went to Mexico and they fucking killed him." I will never forget that. And I will never forget what her handwriting looked like. And I couldn't imagine, then or now, being denied the opportunity to spend my mom's last days with her, to not know the truth about her prognosis so we could plan accordingly, to not be able to hold her and tell her how much I loved her and how much I was going to miss her. And when Mom did die, I was comforted by the fact that I'd been able to be there for her the entire time. But this crook had stolen that from my student, and she knew it. That was the worst part. She knew what she lost, and she was filled with hatred because of it. And as I finished reading her journal, my hands started shaking, and tears started welling up in my eyes. I quickly put a check mark on it, and I handed it back, and I tried not to look her in the eyes. And then I faked like I had a cough. And I excused myself from the classroom. I went to the nearest bathroom, and I hid in a stall, and I cried. I couldn't take it. So now when I think about my role, I'm reminded of a passage from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on intellect. Emerson wrote that God offers to each mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please. You can never have both. Between these, as a pendulum, man oscillates. I don't have to teach this class. I'm the only person who teaches it. I propose it every semester. I don't have to put myself in these emotionally compromising situations. But I do it because I'm not a service provider. I'm called to service, and there's a difference. I'm not called to service by a philosophy or a religion or a politics or a doctrine, but more called to service to help students identify truth, even when that truth, like Emerson wrote, swings them, and frequently me as well, further and further away from a sense of repose. Thank you.